In the early 1960s, the conflict in Vietnam began to escalate, drawing international attention and intervention. While the United States took a leading role in supporting the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North, the United Kingdom's involvement was far more circumspect. Here we explore the UK Cabinet's discussions from 1964 to 1965 regarding the possibility of sending British troops to Vietnam, highlighting key debates, policy decisions, and the rationale behind the UK's eventual position of non-intervention. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. To support this channel and its mission, please subscribe and like the video. By 1964, the situation in Vietnam had deteriorated significantly. The communist-led Viet Cong were intensifying their insurgency against the South Vietnamese government, which was supported by the United States. The US began to increase its military presence in the region, prompting discussions among its allies about potential support. In early 1964, the UK Cabinet, led by Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas-Home, faced mounting pressure from the US to contribute militarily to the effort in Vietnam. However, the Cabinet's deliberations reveal a cautious and pragmatic approach. During a Cabinet meeting on March 5, 1964, Foreign Secretary R.A. Butler expressed concern over the potential quagmire in Vietnam. The situation in Vietnam is exceedingly complex, Butler noted, and the risks of becoming entangled in an unwinnable war are considerable. This sentiment was echoed by Defence Secretary Peter Thornycroft, who argued, "Our military resources are already stretched thin, and committing troops to Vietnam would further strain our capabilities, particularly with our commitments in other parts of the world." Economic considerations also played a significant role. Chancellor of the Exchequer Reginald Maudling emphasised, "The financial implications of entering the Vietnam conflict are substantial. We must weigh the cost against our national interest and current economic constraints." Despite the UK Cabinet's initial reservations, the United States continued to press for British involvement. In a meeting with US officials in June 1964, Prime Minister Douglas-Home assured President Lyndon B. Johnson of the UK's support for American policy in Vietnam, albeit short of committing troops. "We stand with you in opposing communist expansion," Douglas-Home stated, "but we must carefully consider the form our support will take." The UK aimed to maintain a diplomatic balance, supporting the US politically and morally while avoiding direct military involvement. This approach was articulated by Lord Home in a Cabinet meeting on August 14, 1964. "We should offer political and logistical support, but refrain from sending combat troops. This will allow us to maintain our international standing without overcommitting our military forces." The general election in October 1964 brought Harold Wilson's Labour Party to power. Wilson inherited the delicate issue of Vietnam and the pressure from the US to contribute militarily. Wilson's government continued the cautious approach of its predecessor. In a Cabinet meeting on November 10, 1964, Wilson highlighted the importance of a diplomatic solution. "While we acknowledge the severity of the conflict in Vietnam, our primary objective should be to pursue a peaceful resolution through diplomatic channels," Wilson stated. Foreign Secretary Patrick Gordon Walker added, "We must leverage our influence within the United Nations to advocate for negotiations and a potential ceasefire." By early 1965, the US had significantly escalated its military operations in Vietnam. This development led to renewed discussions within the UK Cabinet about the possibility of sending troops. However, the core arguments against military involvement remained consistent. In a Cabinet meeting on February 17, 1965, Defence Secretary Dennis Healey presented a detailed assessment of the situation. "The United States' escalation in Vietnam necessitates a reassessment of our position," Healey acknowledged. "But the fundamental issues persist: the terrain, the nature of the conflict, and the potential for prolonged engagement make it a highly precarious venture." Prime Minister Wilson reiterated his government's stance during this meeting. "Our policy must remain one of strong support for the US diplomatically, while avoiding direct military entanglement. We can provide intelligence, training, and logistical assistance without deploying combat troops." Throughout the discussions, the UK Cabinet also considered the broader implications for the Commonwealth. Countries like Australia and New Zealand were more directly involved in the conflict. The UK sought to balance its support for these allies with its cautious approach to military intervention. In a Cabinet meeting on April 21, 1965, Commonwealth Secretary Arthur Bottomley emphasised the importance of solidarity within the Commonwealth. "We must acknowledge the contributions of Australia and New Zealand," Bottomley argued, "and find ways to support them without compromising our own strategic interests." By mid-1965, it was clear that the UK would not commit combat troops to Vietnam. In a Cabinet meeting on July 7, 1965, Wilson summarised the government's position. "After extensive deliberation, we have determined that the most prudent course of action is to support the United States through non-combat means. Our commitment to a diplomatic resolution remains unwavering." The UK government's decision was communicated publicly with a statement emphasising diplomatic efforts. On July 15, 1965, Wilson announced, "The United Kingdom stands firmly with the United States and our Commonwealth partners in seeking a resolution to the conflict in Vietnam. Our contribution will focus on diplomatic initiatives, humanitarian aid, and support for regional stability." The UK Cabinet's discussions from 1964 to 1965 regarding the potential deployment of troops to Vietnam reveal a consistent approach rooted in caution, pragmatism, and a commitment to diplomacy. Despite considerable pressure from the United States, the UK government prioritised its strategic interests and economic constraints, ultimately deciding against direct military involvement.